Namaskar viewers and listeners of the Great Game Reloaded. I am Tilak Devasher. On 29 September, protests broke out in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir or PoK under the banner of the Jammu Kashmir Joint Awami Action Committee JKJAAC, an umbrella coalition of traders, lawyers and civil society groups. The protests were one of the biggest in recent years, as thousands of people across Muzaffarabad, Mirpur, Kotli, Rawalakot, Neelam Valley and other districts took to the streets. Shops and businesses were shut, public transport disappeared and the region came to a standstill after the JKJAAC called for a shutter down and wheel jam strike. The trigger for the agitation was a 38-point charter of demands. It began with simple issues, subsidized flour, fair electricity tariffs, etc. But it quickly snowballed into something bigger. The people demanded subsidies on essentials, tax relief, demands for cuts in local taxes, roads and infrastructure, medical facilities, judicial governance reforms, etc. End to inflated government and perks for the ruling elite, control over their own resources, abolition of 12 seats reserved for J&K refugees in Pakistan. 6 of these seats are reserved for refugees from Jammu and 6 from Kashmir settled outside PoK in Pakistan. PoK agencies have manipulated these seats to ensure control over the governments in PoK. Initially, the government used armed thugs from government-backed groups to disrupt protests. They opened fire on protesters. One shopkeeper was killed, dozens were injured. Thereafter, the state imposed curfews. Internet services were shut down, thousands of troops were rushed in from Punjab. Authorities also imposed a sweeping communications blackout, cutting internet, mobile and even landline services across the region. But this time, the people were not cowed down. The anger did not fade. It spread. The protests even spread to Islamabad. Police stormed the National Press Club, assaulting journalists who were covering the protests. Cameras were smashed, reporters beaten, protesters dragged out. After it killed 12 people and injured more than 150, imposed a communications blackout and stormed the National Press Club, the government appointed a committee to talk to the protesters. Finally, it caved in due to the united and sustained agitation of the people. It was forced to sign a 25-point agreement that conceded most of the demands of the protesters and tried to claim victory for peace. It was like Pakistan starting a fire, then congratulating itself for throwing a bucket of water. The latest agitation was part of a longer cycle of unrest in PoK, but the scale and substance this time sets it apart. Protests in 2022 and 2023 were triggered by electricity tariff hikes and the withdrawal of flour subsidies, with demonstrators demanding access to resources generated locally. While those grievances remained, the current 38-point charter pressed for structural changes that directly challenged Pakistan's authority. So what did the deal promise? Compensation for the dead, 2 new education boards, MRI and CT scan machines for each district, a Rs 10 billion package for electricity reforms, a trimmed cabinet down to only 20 ministers. And of course, the government says it will build an international airport in Mirpur because nothing says healing from state violence quite like a shiny new airport. The peace deal did not resolve the critical demand of the refugee seats. Instead, it promised a committee to look into the demand. And we all know what happens when committees are appointed. Based on past experiences or promises being made to be broken, the protest leaders are not very optimistic that this time too the agreement will be implemented sincerely, but they are willing to give it a try. The moot question is, why did Islamabad panic and why did they concede the demands? Let's break it down. To begin with, PoK is Indian territory, illegally occupied by Pakistan since 1947, denied basic rights for over 70 years. Pakistan calls this region Azad. Azad meaning free, even though it is anything but free. The PoK government has no real powers. The 1974 interim constitution forces every politician to swear allegiance to Pakistan. The Ministry of Kashmir Affairs in Islamabad controls budgets, police, resources, everything. The people living there call it Azab Kashmir, meaning torment or punishment. And here's the real irony. For over 70 years, Pakistan has claimed to be the voice of Kashmiris. It lectured India on human rights in Kashmir. For Pakistan, PoK was always a card, a way to attack India diplomatically, a way to run terror camps. Pakistan called PoK a base camp for the liberation of Kashmir. But now, the card backfired. For decades, the people of PoK were silent, controlled by fear. Last week, that silence was broken. The people demanded justice from Pakistan itself. They were saying, stop stealing our electricity, stop exploiting our rivers, stop shooting us when we protest, stop manipulating government formation. PoK origin communities in the United States, the United Kingdom and Europe also staged protests in solidarity, adding an international dimension. The diaspora mobilization in Western capitals complicated Pakistan's long-standing narrative of championing Kashmiri rights abroad while failing to deliver governance in the territory it occupied. For Islamabad, the unrest in PoK came at a politically delicate moment. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had been focused on courting international partners such as US President Donald Trump, but the scale of the protests in PoK underlined challenges in his own backyard. Because this time, the demands were not just about subsidies. They went to the heart of Pakistan's control.
इनकलाब अजीम उभरा था इस ज़मीं पर, वो इनकलाब जिसने तमाम मंजर बदल दिए थे, चादर शब उतार दी थी, सुबह के तेवर बदल दिए थे। वो इनकलाब अजीम फिर से पुकारता है, मिजाज बदलो, जब कल भी बदला था तुमने मिलकर, इसी तरह से ही आज बदलो, उदास रहने की रीत बदलो, गुलामियों का रिवाज बदलो।
The protesters wanted refugee seats abolished, the very seats that allowed Pakistan to manipulate the formation of governments. They wanted Islamabad's perks ended. They wanted real autonomy. And for the first time, protests were happening not just in one city, but across districts. Even the diaspora in the UK and Europe had rallied. If Islamabad conceded the demands, abolishing refugee seats, cutting elite perks, sharing resources, it lost control. If it didn't, the protests would have grown stronger. It could not crush the protests without global backlash. It could not ignore them because the world was watching. PoK was becoming Pakistan's nightmare. That's why this moment was different from past unrests. Not surprisingly, Islamabad was rattled. The stakes for Islamabad were not only about meeting or rejecting the JKAAC's 38 demands, they were about whether Pakistan could continue to project control over PoK without confronting rising dissent, both on the ground and on the international stage. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, holidaying in London, ordered probes, formed negotiating committees and appealed for calm. Media reports suggest that he had delayed coming back to Pakistan from the US to enjoy shopping and fine dining in London. And during all this, India watched the developments closely. Defence Minister Rajnath Singh said a few days ago, and I quote, PoK will be ours on its own. PoK itself will say, मैं भारत हूँ, I am India, unquote.
हमारा है ही पीओके और पीओके के लोग स्वयं ये कहेंगे कि मैं भी भारत हूँ.
He was not talking about war. He was talking about reality. The people of PoK were demanding freedom from oppression. India doesn't need to attack. The ground was shifting on its own, and that's how history begins to turn. The Ministry of External Affairs called the unrest, and I quote, a natural consequence of Pakistan's oppression and plunder, unquote. And once again, it underlined Jammu and Kashmir, including POJK, was an integral part of India. But what was unfortunate was the world's silence. The same international media that rushes to report unrest in Srinagar or Anantnag was suddenly blind to Muzaffarabad. The coverage of CNN or BBC was nil or marginal. When Pakistan cracks down in PoK, the world looks away. When India restores order in Jammu and Kashmir, the world lectures about freedom of speech. That double standard is now on full display. So what happens next? The people of PoK would be watching closely how many of the agreed 25 points are implemented and what happens to the committee set up to decide on refugee seats. In reality, it will also be about how long can Pakistan continue to play the Kashmir card that it has played for 75 years. PoK was supposed to be Pakistan's success story, a showcase of azadi, of freedom, in contrast to India's oppression. But the facade has fallen off. Now the world can see that PoK is neither prosperous nor free. It is angry, exploited, and ready to rise. So yes, Pakistan has been forced to sign peace in PoK. It has declared victory after shooting its own people. It has called it a triumph of dialogue after storming a press club. But the truth is, PoK is not celebrating peace. It is counting its dead. And deep down, the people know this peace is just an intermission. Because you can't silence a population forever with tear gas and token packages. Not when their voices are finally being heard, not when they have found strength in unity, not when their demand is no longer about electricity or flour, but about freedom. And when that day comes, Islamabad won't need to sign another deal. It will need to sign a surrender. I am Tilak Devasher. Thank you for watching. Do like, share and comment. Namaskar and Jai Hind.